was that the relationship between citizens and central and local government actually is fundamentally changed. But that also means that the levers for changing society have changed. And they require a lot more skills about understanding how government works, but also there's a lot more lobbying than there was. Because at the moment, the government has put aside money, dollars, but, they haven't necessarily decided to the nth degree what they're going to do with it. So they're open to ideas. Well, that means that you need to figure out which ideas are likely to fly, and you need to get it to the right people. So it's pretty interesting.
Speaking of the intertwining of government and our lives, because it is front and centre, isn't it? What do you think of this challenging the legality of the lockdown that happened in the court recently? We had one person, a professor of law, on who said, look, this is like a legal Rugby World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's extraordinary to them, but...
For everybody else, does it matter?
Does
it?
Really?
It actually does.
Because if you are at a function or you're at a barbecue, you're the kids' afternoon tea, they want to know that you're safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And so public safety is important, but also when you're exercising draconian powers, when it's an emergency situation, and the government has so much power and can be so muscular, we have to make sure that it's transparent. We also need to make sure that people's rights aren't being unduly trammeled.
It's New Zealand.
Oh, look, I know it's New Zealand, but hey, having said that, we just had the Burnham report. I mean, that's a bit of a shocking read. People having brain fades. The public was told a whole pile of things which don't actually turn out to be true. So it is, transparency is pretty important. The rule of law is pretty important. And for me as an immigrant, when I reflect on the values of this country that really matter to me, when I think about why I support a written constitution which has high law entrenched status, which is all mumbo-jumbo to most people, all I reflect on is that I greatly value the rule of law. And that's the difference between us and many other nations.
Right.
That don't experience fairness and justice. And you have to be careful. Rights are easy to take away, and there's always a good justification.
Just on that very briefly, the Burnham report, do you want to touch on that, how you...
Well, it's an important report. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. If it looks kind of big to you, coming in at 400 pages, try chapters 1 and 12. And I must say it's important because, we could easily not have found out about any of that stuff. We were waved away. Oh, nothing to see. It's all fine.
What did David Parker say if the book hadn't been written?
Well, it's interesting because I remember peripherally being interested in this and thinking, oh, well, is this really worth an inquiry? It's a lot of money being put into this. But actually now when you look at what's been found out, it does really make you sit up and think about the large number of things that happen every day based on trust between government and citizen.
Right, thank you, Mae Chen. All right, Alan Blackman, time for I've Been Thinking for you.
I guess I was thinking over the weekend when I heard that a couple of the big drug companies, so Pfizer and Moderna, were looking at starting human trials on their supposed vaccines. And they needed a whopping 30,000 people to volunteer for that. And so I was thinking to myself, gosh, would I be that brave that I would sort of volunteer to, test the efficacy of this and the safety of this? And given...
That's a good question.
Well, given the fact that, 10, 12 years ago or so, there was a drug trial in Britain where... people's heads started expanding and stuff. It really wasn't good. And these 6 volunteers, they were each paid like a couple of £1,000s to test this new anti-leukemia drug, and things went horribly, horribly wrong.
Oh, no.
And so some of them needed sort of to get their fingertips and toes amputated and everything. It was just a horrible thing. So I'm thinking, gosh, they're brave. People who put themselves up willingly for this are brave. And then I thought, gosh, let's go right back to the first vaccination and good old Edward Jenner, who, everybody knows about, 1796. But what people don't know about is who was the first person that was vaccinated. And it was a young kid. He was 8 years old, and he should be much better known to history than he is at the moment. His name was James Phipps, and he was the son of Jenner's gardener. And so basically, without any consent whatsoever, good old Jenner decided to infect him deliberately with cowpox. The reason being that it had been observed that milkmaids would never get smallpox. They'd get a milder version of it, which was called cowpox. And so Jenner sort of put 2 and 2 together, thinking, this cowpox probably confers sort of immunity against smallpox.
Yeah. If my memory serves me correctly, when I was a student in Dunedin, some of my friends would go and do a drug trial.
Yeah.
And actually get paid quite a lot of money. And it was quite tempting. I never got around to do it, but it was a bit of money.
Yeah.
And the consequences and risks weren't that much thought of.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying people are brave doing that. Anything could happen. It gets to the stage of human trials. You think, gosh, it's got to be fairly safe because they've tested it on primates and stuff like that. So you're thinking, but these are brave people. They're going to be saving a lot of lives if this vaccine works.
Blackman and May Chen with me this afternoon. Lots to discuss. Stay with us.
RNZ News at 4 o'clock. Kia ora, good afternoon, I'm Paul Brennan. Auckland Airport has announced its international terminal will be separated into 2 zones in anticipation of a travel bubble. The airport has revealed it's preparing to separate different categories of travellers as they pass through the international terminal in anticipation of a safe air corridor being formed between New Zealand and the Cook Islands. There have now been 18 million cases of the coronavirus recorded globally. The milestone comes as several countries, including the US, Australia and South Africa, struggle to contain fresh outbreaks. The US remains the worst affected country with close to 4.7 million cases and about 155,000 deaths. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, more than 200,000 people have now died from the coronavirus. And New Zealanders in Melbourne are anxiously waiting to find out if their jobs will continue over the COVID-19 lockdown. After a surge in new infections, the state government has brought in tough restrictions on movements and gatherings and will today announce what businesses can continue to operate. New Zealander Brett McCullough, who is a builder in Melbourne, says people are struggling with the uncertainty. The Christchurch City Council-owned alliance company Orion has been accused of making it difficult to properly investigate the cause of the Port Hills fires. 80 claimants who suffered property damage want $10 million, alleging negligence by Orion and the Christchurch Adventure Park. Opening the group's case in the High Court at Christchurch, Craig Stevens said the fire was started by molten metal from a faulting power pole falling onto dry grass. He says Orion's replacing of this pole just 3 days later and failure to retain crucial parts of the old one obstructed the investigation.
It destroyed the area of origin. It disposed of the vital artefact of the expulsion dropout fuse. And Your Honour, that to lose that, it had to be unscrewed.
Lawyer Craig Stevens. A top barrister says he's confident there will be enough jurors to attend trials. Jury trials resume today after a 4.5-month hiatus, but there are now an extra 500 of them in the District Court. A $50 million investment into the judicial system was announced in July, with more judges, staff and resources being brought in. The president of the Criminal Bar Association, Len Anderson,
Kia ora koutou katoa. Good afternoon. This week is the final sitting week of this Parliament, although from turnout I suggest I probably don't need to tell everyone here. I will be in the House on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, where a number of important pieces of legislation will move through their final stages, including the fuel industry bill that legislates to improve competition in the retail fuel market, and the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill, which will bring a fairer and more secure rental market for renters and landlords, as well as family-funded care legislation. On Wednesday, I will join the Associate Education Minister, Minister Martin, at the National Library to help announce the establishment of a new role, the New Zealand Reading Ambassador. On Thursday morning, I will Zoom into a meeting with the Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development Agency and Rob Fife to hear from the business community about further ways we may be able to progress New Zealand's economic recovery. On Thursday afternoon, I'll give my adjournment speech as my first term as Prime Minister wraps up. And on Thursday evening, I will speak at the Indian Newslink lecture in Auckland. On Saturday, I will launch the Labour Party campaign in Auckland. Today, I'm joined by Health Minister Chris Hipkins to update you on our ongoing COVID response and recovery. This may be our last sitting week of Parliament and my last more formal post-Cabinet press conference, but our COVID response continues, and I want to give some detail on how that will work in the ongoing engagement of ministers, even during that campaign period. Cabinet will continue to meet fortnightly to discuss and make key decisions. These will be held on August the 10th, 24th and September the 7th. I'm also able to convene ministers remotely at any point if required, something we have done in more recent times as required, particularly during our COVID response. The Ministry of Health will continue to issue a daily COVID update on key numbers, including cases and any important information for New Zealanders. And the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, will also hold a weekly media press conference, as will the Minister of Health. Our All of Government team has also dialled back up its Unite Against COVID-19 campaign, calling on New Zealanders to be ready, because of course, while we're still at alert level 1, ongoing vigilance is still required. You will start seeing a reiteration of the need to stay home and seek medical advice if you have symptoms, to practice good hygiene, and to keep a record of your movements using the official New Zealand COVID Tracer app, or another method if that works best for you. We have all seen the re-emergence of devastating community transmission in Victoria. While we have gone 94 days without a case in our community, they too had very low numbers for a number of days in June, with some 0 case days. They reported over 600 cases yesterday and have declared a state of disaster. We cannot afford to be complacent, which is why we are dialling back up the COVID messaging in response to some behaviours that we're seeing in New Zealand, and a view that we need to make sure that we maintain that vigilance. In order to stay on top of COVID, we all have a part to play. One of those roles is getting tested. One thing we are finding when digging into some of our lower testing numbers is that people, in some cases, are refusing testing when offered. A recent survey shows a quarter of people have declined a COVID test at their GP. At level 1, ongoing contact and surveillance testing is critical to keeping COVID out and knowing if it has arrived. Someone refusing a test could be the difference between identifying a chain of transmission or it going undetected in our community in a hugely damaging way. Surveillance testing to check for the virus in our community is key because, as the Minister of Health has said today, we have seen how quickly it can spread overseas and around the world. It does remain a raging pandemic. So while our borders remain our first line of defence, surveillance testing is important to ensure it has not crept in undetected. During level 4, we were regularly hitting 6,000 tests a day. We are currently averaging about 2,276. That is roughly a third of what we were, around half of what we are also aiming for at a time when we need to continue to be searching as hard as we can to ensure the virus isn't here. To lift these numbers, we're doing a number of things, including increasing the frequency of testing of staff working at airports and managed isolation and quarantine facilities, as well as providing clear guidance to GPs so that plentiful testing is applied for those who have cold and flu symptoms. And again, one of the things we're combating there is a much lower than usual flu season. And there's something that you all can do to help as well. Please say yes to the test. Our flu tracker is showing lower numbers of people with flu, from 70,000 respondents in lockdown to 50,000 now. While that may be due to increased hygiene measures and also more people being vaccinated and fewer people travelling, if you are sick, do still please go to your GP or seek advice, and if you are offered a test, please say yes. We can only keep this COVID-free status by knowing a sick person isn't a sick person with COVID-19. As a member of our team of 5 million, it's one way that you can make a contribution to keeping New Zealanders safe, and it will be hugely appreciated. In summary, work goes on, the structural oversight of our COVID response continues, and we must all remain vigilant. We are now happy to take your questions, and I include in that the Minister of Health. Jason.
Just on the change in the branding to Be Ready, is that a reflection on the fact that Kiwis are now a little bit more complacent?
Yeah, so obviously when we moved into level 1, that was always our intent, was that those basics would be maintained, that if people are sick, they stay home, that they keep up those personal hygiene measures, and of course if they have those symptoms that fall into that category, that they are getting tested. We have seen, however, that there is a bit of a sense that New Zealand is free of COVID, and therefore that vigilance isn't required. We still need people to be on guard, and so that is one of the reasons why we have that extra messaging and are encouraging people, of course, to use the COVID tracker to help us should we ever need to trace your steps.
Do you regret at all not changing the amount of statutory minimum sick leave that all employees have? Would that encourage people more to stay home more often if they were perhaps
Oh, we do. Of course, we still have the COVID sick leave provisions available and the ability to cover people, and that's been an important part of our response. So if someone is in need of, does need to stay at home for COVID-related reasons, we have that mechanism in place. That's also been important for our public health units, so they know that if they're asking someone to stay at home, there is that provision there and that discretion to be able to make sure that they have financial support if they are staying home for those reasons.
Basically, everyone should stay home if they're unwell. Would COVID leave cover,
We've
cover all of that?
No, so obviously those are specific to those circumstances, but we are still asking people to stay at home if they're sick, and that has been part of our ongoing messaging. Of course, if they're then getting a test, you can demonstrate whether or not it's COVID related, or if a PHU has asked you to stay in quarantine, then of course you're again covered by COVID related costs.
So have you completely ruled out a Trans-Tasman bubble for this year?
I haven't put a time frame on it, but everyone can see, based on our clear criteria right from the beginning, that we will not open a Trans-Tasman bubble until it is safe. It will be obvious to everyone that that is not right now, and it will not be for some time to come.
Open to all states, barring Victoria?
Again, that would all firstly come down to Australia's decision making. Secondly, it would come down to very tight border controls and restrictions so that you could guarantee that there weren't any issues with movement between the likes of Victoria and others. To date, we have seen cases that have come through at the border within Australia, nor have we had any suggestion from Australia that that's the way that they would like to approach movement with New Zealand.
In that same vein, when you were talking about a Pacific or any potential Pacific bubble, you were talking about one of the barriers being safety through the airport. Auckland Airport has just announced...
Yes, I just saw there.
Does that satisfy your concern?
That is not, well, firstly, and I will let the Minister of Health speak to this as well. Firstly, our borders, and I include very much the physical space of airports, are places where people with COVID are moving and interacting and engaging. So they are very high-risk environments. We need to be absolutely assured when we're looking at any Pacific bubble with the likes of the Cook Islands that there is no contact between both people who may have come from high-risk areas, but also making sure even that we're not engaging with the same surfaces. That's the level of rigour that we need. It's not the only thing. We have to have in place a legal arrangement, protocols for pre-checks for arrival and departure, health declarations and whether they're taken from health or airlines, and whether or not you'd have things like testing or temperature checks as extra layers. We have to move through this very, very carefully.
Does this move us any closer to getting to a bubble, the fact that airports are making these safe travel zones?
Oh, it's one part of many elements that need to be worked through. And just the one thing that I would say is that many of you will remember that there was a lot of pressure for us to move quickly on a Trans-Tasman bubble. We have always moved cautiously and with very good reason. I feel utterly justified in making sure that if we move to quarantine-free travel, even with a place that is declared COVID-free such as the Cook Islands, we have to do it with absolute caution for New Zealand's safety and for the safety of the Pacific.
How worried are you about us infecting them?
Oh, that has to be a key consideration. But equally, we also have to think about not just whether or not someone's come in to the border COVID-free, but whether or not they can manage to get through the airport whilst maintaining COVID-free status as well.
Presumably with 90 days,
I'll just finish you.
Presumably with all those days of no community transmission found, there is a COVID in New Zealand to be carried to Cook Islands.
Again, as I've set out, it's not just around the status of those who are moving through, but their engagement even in an airport and border environment that we also need to be cautious around. And equally, we are saying that we need to maintain our vigilance within New Zealand to maintain our community, our transmission-free status within New Zealand. We also need to have extra checks and balances to make sure that not only are we maintaining it, but we don't potentially risk exporting anything as well. Is there anything you want to add on that, Minister?
No, I think the Prime Minister's covered it all. There's a huge number of different variables that we have to work through. We have to think about the arrangements when people arrive in the Cook Islands, if it was the Cook Islands that we're talking about, and the travel back. We have to think about how we handle transit passengers. There are a whole variety of issues that we need to work through very, very carefully. I don't think anybody in New Zealand wants to be responsible for us inadvertently seeing COVID-19 make its way into the Pacific where it's not currently present.
Yeah.
Just on the National Climate Change Risk Assessment that came out today, are things in a better or a worse situation than what you would have expected, given this is the first sort of comprehensive assessment that's been done? And do you agree with James Shaw's assessment today that up until this point, climate change has been dealt with in terms of a sort of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff approach?
Now, I don't think anyone will be surprised to see in a national risk assessment issues like sea level rises, ecosystems, social inequalities being impacted by the effects of climate change, and risks to coastal buildings and so on, in large part because we're already seeing it. We've recently seen investment from this government into Northland and Southland around flood protections, and that is because we are increasingly experiencing severe weather events. The question for us is, of course, making sure that we're continuing to invest in both mitigation, which we have, but also adaptation, as we see the full risk assessment that demonstrates there's some areas where we actually just need to prepare ourselves, whilst at the same time not accepting the inevitability of sea level rises while we have the ability to make a difference.
Central government New Zealand says that there's a massive legislative hole when it comes to central government around allowing councils to actually do their adaptation style work, and obviously there's been a reference to it with the RNA, but that could potentially be years away.
So I think you've already seen, and perhaps you have already seen where central government, particularly in recent times, has been investing directly in local communities to support flood protections is a very good example. But there is an ongoing issue that, yes, we have discussed between ourselves, both local and central government, need to resolve, some of where that liability exists for ongoing adaptation. We aren't through that conversation yet, but where there's immediate need, you'll see that we are already partnering and moving on some of that.
Prime Minister, you said before that you're a bit concerned by some behaviours we're seeing in New Zealand in relation to COVID. What behaviours are those?
Oh, just as I've said, just a sense that perhaps our COVID-free status within the community is not something that we need to continually work hard to maintain. So just things like if someone's offered a test, refusing to take it. That's where I'm asking, I know that, of course, people will often tend to be a bit dismissive. They'll feel like perhaps what they've got is just a flu and they don't need to worry. It is hugely helpful to us if people accept a request from a GP for someone to have a test. I'll come back to Jackson.
Prime Minister, just back on the Trans-Tasman.
Oh, sorry, Barry. It's a rare thing that I don't hear you, but Jackson, and then I'll come to you, Barry.
First. Just back on the bubble, I know you don't want to speculate, and you've never wanted to speculate about a time frame, but at this stage, is quarantine-free travel by Christmas unlikely, or is it still realistic?
Oh, I think people can see for themselves that while we're seeing a whole of Australia approach to travel, and while we've got border movements between Australia, that it is going to take a significant amount of time before we will have the state of Victoria back in a COVID-free status, and that will be obvious to everyone. I don't think that you need to be an epidemiologist to see the very difficult path that they currently are on. We wish Victoria, all the very best as they continue to combat what is a devastating situation. But I think the reality for both of us is that this is going to slow things down for us. Barry.
Is it fair to see this upcoming election as a COVID election, given that you indicated this morning that the manifesto will be fairly light on policy this year?
Well, I think the way that I would describe it is that in large part, yes, the next 3 years have been predetermined by the need for whoever makes up the future government to continue to lead us through our health and our economic response. And we have already laid out a very significant plan, including a very significant investment regime, as part of our plan on COVID recovery and rebuild. And it is significant. We, for some time to come, will be continuing to make investments in skills, in job creation, in small business investment, and the work we're doing with foreign partners around trade and export growth. So, yes, you're right, COVID will predetermine a lot of what we debate this election, but voters still have a choice to make as to whether or not they continue with the plan that we've pitched, or whether or not they choose to stop and move on to an alternate program. Well, you can expect that we will have points of difference. We will still have policy that as a Labour Party will roll out. But it is clear that the fiscal position we as New Zealand finds itself in is tight. We have had to include additional borrowing for the likes of the wage subsidy, which is the right thing to do, but we also have to maintain careful fiscal management, and that will be part of our thinking for any future policies.
Just following on from that, can you just give people an idea of what they can expect from Labour on the campaign trail in the next few weeks?
Yeah, the public will continue to hear our plan for the COVID recovery and rebuild. And we're asking to keep going. We already have momentum with our 5-point plan, which is about investing in New Zealanders' skills. It is about creating jobs. It is about supporting small businesses who are the ones creating employment opportunities, and making sure that when we are rebuilding, we're rebuilding New Zealand back better, investing in, for instance, energy and waste projects, things that are challenges anyway. So those are the types of initiatives we will keep taking to New Zealanders. We're asking to keep going rather than to put the brakes on our recovery.
And in your opening statements,
do we need a new top tax bracket to help deal with the debt that we're taking on for the COVID response?
You will have heard me this morning talk about our plan around debt. And of course, our debt trajectory has been set out in the budget, and the very clear difference between that's emerging between the opposition and the current government is our plan to grow the economy by investing in our people, by investing in job creation, versus the alternative, which is austerity measures and up to $80 billion worth of cuts, which could include health and education. So there are very clear differences in the way that we plan to deal with those issues over the coming decade.
Debt to 30% of GDP in a decade like National is...
No, we have already, you can already see at the budget that debt track was laid out. We disagree with the opposition who have proposed what would be significant and deep cuts to services like health and education in order to take that kind of debt track. Keeping in mind, because of the very, very low rate of debt we had through our careful fiscal management going into this crisis, our position after using, for instance, spending on the likes of the wage subsidy means that we'll come out the other side with debt at a lower rate that many countries went in some cases half the rate that many countries went in.
What about campaigning on a higher tax bracket?
I've been very careful to point out that we haven't put out some final parts of the Labour Party's policy. Happy to debate those at the time we do, but you can already see some of the clear differences emerging between Labour and National.
Bernard. So just a final question on that. Would Labour introduce income insurance?
You will have already said through the tripartite future of work that we've already signalled that through the likes of the global financial crisis, through the earthquakes, and now through COVID, every government, both Labour and National governments, have responded with something that looks like a form of our income payment that we put in recently. So that demonstrates that there is some work there to be done. We've said we'd like to keep doing that work. The Council of Trade Unions and Business New Zealand agree with us, and so that's something that we've indicated already.
Minister,
I will come to Bernard.
If
Labor was to win on its own or with the Greens, would you like a mandate to do transformational tax and welfare reform?
Well, we will campaign on Labor's policy, and we'll campaign on our position on a number of issues to try and seek the strongest mandate we can as a party. We're not here to campaign on behalf of anyone else. We will, however, stand proudly on the coalition government's record. So,
change the tax or welfare system?
again, I'll refer back to my previous question. We have, for a large part, you will have seen already some significant approaches between what we have proposed as a government and the opposition. For finer detail around some of these policy issues, you won't have to wait too much longer. We do know that these are some of the issues that people want to hear about quite quickly.
You said in your opening remarks,
and then I'll come back to.
You said in your opening remarks, my first term as Prime Minister. Is that basically an indication for you that you've got this election in the bag?
No, it was a statement of fact.
Are you considering pulling out any more the WEAG policies? Are you considering?
Oh, sorry. If you have another question, Jason.
No,
I don't want to be flippant, but no.
Fair enough,
You will see the way that I always talk. I often preface with, should we be re-elected? Should we have the privilege of forming government? We take nothing for granted. I have been around politics for too long to take anything for granted. The 2017 election, a lot of people made assumptions about that. We will campaign hard every single day. I assume nothing, but of course I am equally very proud of our record, and I will campaign on it strongly.
Testing, you're currently having to use a survey of GPs, which is not scientific, it's a kind of self-testing survey, and that's all the data you really have on whether people are
On people response, yeah.
Are you looking to
It's
get
New Zealand, you also get a lot of anecdata.
Yeah.
But you want more than anecdata, presumably. Are you looking to get more concrete statistics on how many people are refusing tests? And do you have those statistics for the test done in managed isolation and quarantine?
In answer to the first part of your question, obviously we're always after better data. What I don't want to do, though, is create an entire bureaucracy around collecting data that we can get more efficiently through other means. The survey data is actually pretty reflective of the feedback that we're getting, that increasing numbers of people are saying no, they don't want to have a test. And as the Prime Minister has said, our clear message to them is, play your part as the team of 5 million and have your test. If you're offered a test, take the test. You're being offered the test for a very, very good reason, and we do need people to take those tests. I'm working with the Ministry of Health at the moment on looking at how they present the data from managed isolation and quarantine facilities, just to get a better line of sight between the cohorts coming through and the daily testing rate, just so that we can be absolutely certain that we're getting the right rate of testing. Now, there won't always be a direct correlation between the number of people at day 3, for example, and the number of day 3 tests, because we don't test babies, for example. But we just want to know that we're getting the right match up there. The overall numbers of testing that we're getting at day 3 and at day 12 roughly lines up with the proportion of the MIQ population that you would expect to be tested on a daily basis. So we're pretty confident about that, but I just think for the avoidance of doubt and for public transparency purposes, it wouldn't hurt for us to be able to do that. Now, the biggest issue there is a data matching exercise, and so there's some work going on to make that happen.
Yeah.
You use the test inside the hotels, right?
Sorry?
People are generally saying
Yes, because if they don't, they stay in the hotel for longer.
That's right. Day 3. What happens if they say no at day 3?
Look, at the end of the day, they're encouraged to take the test at day 3. There is huge incentive for them to have the day 12 test, because that's the one that they have to have a negative test result for before they are released. Most people are doing the day 3 test as well.
Yeah.
So just a question again about...
So there's allegations within the Fire Emergency New Zealand of sexual assault and harassment. What's your response to that, and is that behaviour acceptable?
So my understanding is that, to answer the last part of your question, no. Fire and Emergency New Zealand brought in Judge Carol Shaw in 2018 to do a piece of work around the environment within FENZ after, as I understand, complaints were made. And as a result of that, I'm also told that they are working through establishing a complaints mechanism that responds to some of the allegations that have been made. What we will need to make sure is that any mechanism that is brought in, complainants have to have faith in. There is no point establishing a system that is just underutilised or does not have the support of people who have had these experiences in the first place.
On the independent authority to take over the complaints, is that good enough that Crown agencies can't handle their own complaints?
Well, we have seen situations before where in order to make sure that we have culture change where there have been significant issues, to give confidence back to those who have had these experiences. You know, you will often have, you know, that level of independence, and I don't think we should shy away from being willing to do that, particularly if it brings that confidence to people who have had these experiences. Ultimately, though, it's not good enough for this to be happening in any agency or indeed any workplace. So it is all about what we do to fix it.
Experience in Victoria where suburban lockdowns have been largely ineffective. Has that influenced your thinking around regional or local lockdowns?
I do think it's important to just look at when we were talking about the use of more localised lockdown, you'll remember that we were also talking about very specific scenarios. So I do think what we were very clear on at that point, and will continue to be, is that it does rely on you having very clear data and information about cases and their reach. We have also always said that where you're in an unknown situation, a precautionary approach is required. And so that was the approach that you will have seen in that broad overview we gave around the resurgence plan, and I think that is reinforced by what we've seen in Melbourne.
Prime Minister, previously...
Ben. And I'll come to Ben and then Jenna, I'll come to you.
Thanks. A question on the bubble and a question on the campaign.
Yeah.
Previously Australia was first came off the rank. It was going to be the first place open. Obviously the cases had rendered that impossible, pivoting to the Pacific.
Yep.
But might be of a mind to also pivot to a place like Taiwan or another place in Southeast Asia, now that we know that one of your criteria is 28 days without community transmission.
Yeah, one of a range. It's not the only thing. And you will have heard us talk about reversing the order actually a little while ago. And one of the other reasons is that you'll see that we're focusing in on very particular countries within the Pacific, not necessarily the whole Pacific, is because they are realm countries. These are individuals who are passport holders that have a right to travel and move between New Zealand and either the Cook Islands or, say, Niue. Tokelau is a bit of an exception because, of course, you can only travel into Tokelau through Samoa, and so that adds a little extra layer of complication. But that is the reason we are treating the realm countries differently.
That's not a question that I asked. Would you be then going to
Yes,
Taiwan?
you will. It was what you asked. You asked, given we were doing that, would we do the same with others? I was pointing out that there are specific circumstances that mean we're doing them first.
That next tier yet?
No, at the moment, no. We're prioritising the realm. We haven't thought more broadly. We have always, when working through some of the criteria, had a mind to the fact that we may in the future have approaches. We would have, however, very strict criteria we would apply in those circumstances, but it's not on our mind currently.
Just on the campaign, if I might, I'm just trying to understand the expectations, because you've said this morning that there's not going to be this big screed of manifesto. Well, of course, most people equate manifestos with large spending decisions as well. This is not the environment for that. That's what I was going to say. Is this just going to be an election campaign for our times? Is it going to be run on our record, not our dreams, because we just can't afford it?
Oh, well, I don't know that I would be still inclined to say that this isn't still an opportunity for us. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's undeniable that COVID is going to shape this election. Because this is the biggest challenge New Zealand has faced, and some would say 100 years. It will have a huge impact on our economy for generations, but that does still mean we have choices. In the past, when we have faced economic challenges, one of the choices has been to cut services, to lead to situations with high-level unemployment, and it has predominantly been groups like young people and Māori who have paid the price of that. The other choice, however, is to use our ability to invest in things like the wage subsidy, or to invest in things like training, and to invest in areas where we already had issues, a lack of public housing, the chance to increase New Zealand's renewable energy options to face the future, make sure that we can do more of our waste management within New Zealand. There are opportunities here to realise some of the aspirations we have as a country, even if it's a crisis that has expedited it.
Prime Minister, why Prime Minister,
I will come to Jenna. I did say Jenna next, and then Bernard. Yes, I don't necessarily need to reward volume, but I will come to you anyway.
Yep. Sorry, can I just ask about cystic fibrosis? There's mounting pressure from cystic fibrosis sufferers for the miracle drug Trikafta to be funded.
Yeah.
Scotland's government has bypassed the equivalent of our Farm Act to fund cystic fibrosis drugs. Why can't your government do the same?
Oh, so for one thing, my understanding is that Farm Act hasn't actually received an application for funding for this drug, but putting putting that aside, you know, you all well know that we have got a distinction between these decisions being made between politicians and Pharmac. Our view is that we aren't the people to make these decisions. However, that hasn't stopped us increasing the ability for Pharmac to make them. So we have had $405 million go into Pharmac. Now, I acknowledge that some of that, $185 million, has been to deal with some of the COVID-related costs, but some of that funding has actually enabled Pharmac to provide another drug for cystic fibrosis, but ultimately those are decisions for Pharmac.
A kilo drug would cost $200 million a year to prolong the lives of New Zealand cystic fibrosis sufferers. Surely that's outweighed by the benefit to the economy of keeping
Yeah,
them alive.
again, you know, as I've said, decisions around what drugs are funded, they are rightly made by those who are in a position to make those decisions rather than politicians. But what we have done is put $400 million more into Pharmac to give them the ability to make some of those choices for new drugs, be it cancer or, in the case of cystic fibrosis, another drug that has been funded by them.
Pharmac decisions are taking, 6 years to come to fruition. Do you understand why the drug companies aren't putting forward the proposals and that sort of thing? Does it need to be sped up?
Well, that won't always necessarily be the case. And again, as I say, my understanding is that they haven't actually received an application for that drug. You know, I will stand corrected if that's...
Go through the process, so they're struggling with the process. Does something need to be done to speed up that agency?
And there's plenty of examples that will not take that length of time as well. Okay, everyone, you will still have me on a daily basis, even if it's not at this podium.
An Australian comedian in his...
Oh, sorry, Bernard, I gave you the next question, forgive me.
I didn't want to...
Oh, no, okay.
Yes,
Go ahead.
I would like to ask.
Go ahead.
Why do you say the budget situation is tight and therefore you can't propose more aggressive policy?
Ah, actually, no, that's
when you can borrow at 0.7%.
That's a good question. Look, because we have always been careful around our fiscal management. In fact, I would point to you, Bernard, as one of the people who were not necessarily in favour of us getting debt down to below 20% before we came into this COVID crisis. But actually, I stand by that decision because it has now meant when that rainy day of COVID arrived, we are now in a position where even at its peak, we will have debt levels lower than some of those countries in the OECD that we compare ourselves to before they even went into COVID. And so that is something that I maintain as being important. We have to maintain that fiscal management and discipline. We are a country who tends to experience shocks. The pandemic, in this case, everyone is experiencing, but our earthquakes are something unique to us. And so I do think that careful management is still required.
An Australian...
Just the last couple.
Okay, an Australian comedian in a stand-up show is being caught on camera making light of the Christchurch mosque attacks. I won't repeat the joke, but is that an acceptable thing for a comedian to be doing?
Look, if I'm talking in very general terms, no one in New Zealand, of course, would ever, want to see anyone taking lightly something that had such an extraordinary impact on our Muslim communities in the entire country. I can't really comment further than that because I'm only responding to what you've described to me. Oh, as I've said, no one in this country would wish to see anyone take lightly something that had such an extraordinary impact on our nation. I haven't seen what's in question, but that would be my general sentiment to anyone who would seem to take that issue that has burned deeply into our history anything but seriously.
With income insurance, are you thinking about sort of having something permanent or just extending the current income payment, by a year or for sort of a medium length?
As I've said, this is just something we've flagged that we believe extra work should be done, particularly given we've seen it used a number of times. As I've already said, the tripartite future of work, that forum, we believe would be the best place to keep that work going because it has been supported by Business New Zealand and the CTU. But in terms of detailed policy responses, those are questions I can't answer for now. But what I don't want to see is just that ongoing ad hoc behaviour in response to what has been a pattern. Okay, we'll take last one here.
In terms of beneficiaries with children, they're still being hit by drug sanctions. Is this acceptable, and what do you say to those kids?
Oh, actually, the last time this was raised when we dug into it, actually the number of cases there were very, very small. My recollection is far less than 10. And in those cases, it was after a lot of work had been done by MSD to try and get support for families. Now, that is the first port of call. We do want families to receive a health response rather than a punitive one, and that is the initial response that MSD is and should be taking in those cases. Okay, thanks everyone.